Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be approaching a subject that I know each and every one of us certainly have experience with, and that is the experience of having family. Now, some of us may be sitting there watching the Hallmark Channel and realizing that, this is the kind of family ideally I would like to have. After all, we're gathered around Thanksgiving, everybody enjoyably praying and then diving into the family meal and thinking to themselves, well, how come I don't have that kind of dynamic going on for myself? In fact, when was the last time I even attended a Thanksgiving or a Christmas event in which there wasn't some sort of chaos or a feeling of dread at the fact that I even have to show up at the door? On our program today, we're going to be joined by someone who is a retired family therapist, who is also an active life coach, and the author of more than 50 books, including his latest book, Overcoming Your Difficult Family. He has been quoted or featured in a variety of publications, including Martha Stewart Living, Red Book, Glamour, Men's Health, and so on. He's going to be joining us here on the program today to talk about strategies that can be implemented immediately and how we can learn to maintain inner peace in the midst of all of the family chaos that may be going on, and maybe even create a better life for a family as a whole. I'd like to welcome the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of Overcoming Your Difficult Family, our guest, Dr. Eric Maisel. Dr. Maisel, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. Great to be with you. Call me Eric, please.
Eric will work for me, but sometimes you just don't know because you know how
Indeed.
Families are about titles sometimes.
Absolutely.
Now,
we can be fussy.
Now, let's talk about how you got into this range of work here, because I'll bet you've probably seen a wide variety of things going on in the world when it comes to family.
Well, I probably have to go all the way back to the beginning to answer that question. I grew up in one of those largish families. My mom had 3 sisters, and I think they all lived at home at one point or another, and they were the grandparents and half-generation other kids. My brother and sister were kind of a half-generation older, and people were always coming and going. And I think way back then I understood how chaotic and difficult family life was and how much I would much prefer to be off in a corner reading a book than dealing with what the family was going through. And then I got interested in first philosophy and then psychology and became a family therapist. And I became a family therapist because I didn't believe the model that we've had for the last 100 years of individual pathology. That is, that some kind of mental cold descends, that we catch the mental flu or something, as opposed to our distress being contextual. Things like families matter when it comes to what causes us distress. So that's why family therapy interested me.
Now, it's certainly true that I think a lot of us would like to experience what you see as the ideal family through shows and movies. Everybody seems to be getting along, supporting each other, things like that. What exactly goes on there that maybe most of us don't have that kind of an experience?
Well, I think the simple way to think about reality is we know that half of marriages end in divorce, and more than half, up to 75% of second marriages and third marriages end in divorce when there are now blended families involved. So I think that's proof on the face of it that tons of families are experiencing strife between husband and wife or husband and husband. So that strife is going on. Each person comes into the world with what I call an original personality, which psychology doesn't look at all. It doesn't really look at the idea that we come into the world already somebody. But I think we come into the world already somebody, maybe a little sadder than the next person, a little more anxious than the next person, a little more sensitive, whatever. So everybody in the family has that original personality and all kinds of agenda items that are flowing from that original personality. Plus, human beings are pretty thin-skinned. We're pretty good at holding a resentment for about 75 years or what have you. We don't get over things that easily. So if you put it all together, I think we understand that the reality is far more difficult than the idealization of a family.
Now, you outline different family types, I guess, but before we get into that, the question becomes then, is it up to the individual who approaches this or the whole family? It seems like it can be a lot of work when it comes to, I guess, learning how we can cope with whatever family situation we may be in.
Well, we can't control others. We learn that over time. We can hardly influence others. I do think that some of the strategies that I include in the book would help one maybe influence family life for the better. Maybe you can deal better with a sibling or a parent or a child by using some of the strategies, but basically all we can do is take care of ourselves. And safety comes first. We don't want to be abused. We don't want to be harmed, so that comes first. But basically we have to take care of ourselves. If we want to go the next step and be a generous, courageous person and try to do some good work within the family also, that's great. But we have to do that work understanding that there's no way we can control anybody else.
So that kind of falls in line then with what you talk about in your book on being smart. First of all, realizing, look, you can't change everybody else, but you can certainly change the way you experience the situation.
You can change the way you experience the situation, including getting out of the way, including maybe making peace with the fact that you have to avoid certain family members. Everybody knows over time that they have to avoid certain family members, but they may not make peace with that understanding. They may keep hoping that something will change or that somehow they're at fault for not giving that person a 100th chance and 101st chance and what have you. So that's one of the ways of being smart, is understanding that we may have to get out of the way of difficult situations. And if we know that there's a certain time of the day, if you have a sibling and you know that when he comes home from practice, he's at his most rambunctious because he's been pushed around and pushing around boys all day long, well, that may be the time to stay out of the house or stay out of his way. So there are lots of things to be smart about, and that is the first skill of the 8 skills in the book, is just the simple idea of getting better at understanding what's going on around you.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also talk about, too, that it's important that if you're going to approach this, that you have to find how you can gain fortitude, stamina, and inner strength. Tell us exactly what it is that you mean by that, what needs to happen there.
I think life weakens us. Infants come into the world pretty strong. They have a good crying voice. They know what they want. And then over time, we're taught by school to draw within the lines, and we have all of our family rules, and the adults are way bigger than we are, bigger than the children are. So over time, we lose a certain essential strength. Some few human beings retain that strength, but most people get weaker than they want to be, and they know it. They know that they're lacking in something, a little self-confidence, a little moxie, a little chutzpah, a little something that they wish they would have. So rediscovering that, reclaiming that strength, there are lots of times where we have to stand up in family life. We don't want to be squashed. And it's very scary. That's why another skill is courage. It's very scary to do that standing up, but we understand that we need to do that and that there are going to be consequences. It's not like the strength is just finally saying something. The strength is both finally saying something and then dealing with the consequences of having said that.
I know one of the things you also talk about, too, is I found this, how to communicate better when you talk about being clear. Sometimes you kind of wonder, should I be communicating with anybody at all or just stay quiet and stay out of the whole thing?
Well, that's true. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes that is the case, that staying quiet is the best bet. But if you know that you should speak, then I have a little simple ABC rule: affirmative, brief, and clear. And the brief is almost as important as the clear, because I think as soon as we start to say long sentences with lots of clauses, then we're really kind of apologizing perhaps, or disguising our real message, or just not getting to the point. So I have clients try to say things in 7 words or fewer when they have something important to say, like, that's not okay, which is 3 or 4 words. I mean, sometimes we have to be exactly that clear and exactly that brief in order to get our message across.
It was funny when we first got this book here, and I looked at that and thought to myself, well, family, boy, there's certainly a crazy subject to talk about here, especially for all of us, as I was mentioning earlier in the program, who have certainly had a wide range of experiences.
Yep.
Especially when it comes to the time when you actually marry and you merge with someone else's family. And here's been a dynamic that I've seen, I call it somewhat consistently anyway, is that you tend to, let's say in my case, my wife's side of the family, on the father's side, it seems everybody appears to tell you how it is, they mince no words, that sort of thing, so you can kind of trust that. And then on the other side, it seems, on the mother's side, that everybody's sort of backbiting and talking about each other. Sure, we're going to show up at the family picnic and everybody's smiling, but there seems to be a knife in the back somewhere.
Exactly.
Now, I don't know if that's the case with a lot of people. It could be vice versa, but that was my experience.
Exactly. I think it's probably different for each family as to, who's doing what, whether it's your own family or your mate's family. But very typically, something is going on at one of these events that's kind of intolerable, causes us to want to leave after about 13 minutes, or as you said at the opening of the show, not show up at all. That's most typical because, we don't really see any particularly good reason to go to a place where the dynamics are like that, where there's so much tension or maybe folks are insulting each other. Or nowadays, with these super large political divides, where people have a different view of life, and you may find the other person's view intolerable, and he or she may find your view intolerable. And we kind of know not to talk about those things, religion, politics, what have you. We kind of know not to talk about them, but they're so on our minds that it's kind of hard to push them off to a corner and not talk about them. So I think there's a lot of tension in families, intergenerational tension, sibling tension. In some ways it feels like what it must have been like at the beginning of the Civil War, where people had to take sides on huge issues. Feels like we're taking sides on huge issues again.
And sometimes you would think in families that you would agree, but certainly when it comes to things like that, well, we all tend to change. That was certainly featured in the movie, what was it, The Butler, where, the butler serves the President of the United States over a couple of decades, different presidents, and then his young son steps up to bat and says, well, there are things that I see that are going on that I just certainly don't agree with.
That's right.
And then finally, the butler himself realizes, I know I'm serving dedicatedly the president here, but maybe this is a view that I need to really consider here, even though I may or may not agree with what my son is doing.
Absolutely, and I think we face those complexities all the time. Maybe we're for a war that our country's fighting, and we get more information about the war, and we doubt its wisdom, and now we're against the war our country is fighting, or vice versa. These complexities are very disorienting, and we're trying to live our day in and day out lives of just doing our duties and responsibilities and running errands and what have you, and then all of this other stuff is churning within us also. It makes life extra difficult.
Now, what I'd like to do for the listeners here is briefly go over what you would consider to be the, family types here. And certainly the listeners can feel whether or not, which particular category they may belong in, or maybe you have a little mix and mash of each one of these. Now,
right.
Did you create these here as a result of your experience over the years working with families?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
It just seemed logical to me. So I've sort of described 10 family types, and as you say, these aren't perfectly discrete categories. Real human beings are more mixed than the way I made these categories. But I did think it was valuable for a person to think about, maybe for the first time, well, maybe I grew up in a loveless family, and that's why I feel so cold and alone. Or maybe I grew up in a family that was basically frustrated and defeated, and that's why I think I don't have a chance. So I thought it was a useful kind of educational scheme to help folks think a little more deeply about what their family might have been like.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and start with the first one here, and that is the sad and anxious families. Give us an idea how you would describe something like that.
Well, because we know that It is an epidemic of diagnosing of clinical depression and generalized anxiety disorder. We know that a lot of people are, to use everyday language, sad and anxious. It makes sense that whole families might, so to speak, carry that flavor. And if your whole family is anxious, life already makes us anxious. If your whole family is anxious, you're necessarily going to be more anxious than the next person. It just makes sense, which means that it's going to be on your shoulders more than the next person to really master some anxiety management tools. So you'll need everyday techniques for dealing with sadness, like exercise and getting sunlight, and just everyday things, and also everyday anxiety management techniques like learning how to do a little deep breathing or learning how to do some relaxation exercise. That is, there are things for an individual to try within a family if that family flavor is a sad and anxious flavor.
So we can certainly go back to the tools that we were talking briefly about earlier. So being calm seems to be one of the biggest ones.
It does, and I try to include ceremonies in each of the chapters because to me is a way of sort of carving out a little chunk of time where you do something with some presence and some carefulness. And one of the ceremonies I like around calmness, folks like this, seems to work for them, is the idea of getting a snow globe and shaking it so that the snow is agitated. And as the snow settles, feel yourself settling. I think it's a nice visual representation of what settling looks like, so to speak. So you're right. I think calmness is one of the most important of the 8 skills. And there are ways to practice calmness different from having a whole hour sitting meditation each morning or what have you. There are quicker things, smaller things to try that will allow you to create calmness quickly.
Now, you also talk about something when it comes to that particular family type that people should also consider, too, is that in here you may have people who, for instance, may be suffering from depression to the point that medication is involved. But certainly we've heard stories about that. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, it's a complicated matter because I'm in the camp, and there is a camp. It has 3 names, this camp. We haven't settled on the name. It's called either critical psychology, critical psychiatry, or anti-psychiatry. And in this camp, we do not believe that the medication that people are taking are really medications, but rather that they're chemicals with powerful effects, because we don't believe that the diagnoses are really legitimate, that clinical depression is a really legitimate diagnosis. The phenomenon is legitimate. Sadness, despair, all the other things we could name, that's all legitimate. But acting like it's a pseudo-medical condition, there are no tests for it, there's no proof that it's actually a medical condition, no proof whatsoever. So that's a longish way of saying, because lots of folks are taking these chemicals with powerful effects, there are powerful effects. And some of those powerful effects are that folks get more suicidal rather than less suicidal, or have all kinds of side effects that we understand that go on with these powerful chemicals. So if you're in that kind of family where somebody is taking chemicals for whether it's so-called depression or so-called generalized anxiety disorder, then you're dealing with a person who's experiencing something, the sadness, the anxiety, and is also now experiencing all kinds of effects from the medication itself. Nothing in particular that you can do except to be aware of this reality, and maybe if you felt like it, try to inform the person, send the person to one of those good websites in the world that take the alternate view from the mainstream view. I think the best one is what's called madinamerica.com. It's a website put together by Robert Whitaker, who has done an important book called Anatomy of an Epidemic. And so if you're in that kind of family, you might want to inform yourself and inform others about alternate views to what's going on.
I just felt that was important, and I'm glad that you touched on it this way, because we seem to become, one of these chemically dependent societies that we need these things, or so we're told. And as a result, you're seeing behaviors that I think commonly may not be there, that are enhanced more often in very negative ways that can really have an effect on relationships.
Especially in kids nowadays, there's an opiate epidemic, and how surprising is that when you give kids opiates like Ritalin to deal with what I believe is a fictitious diagnosis of ADHD. So yes, especially for kids. I mean, adults, to my mind, adults are adults. If they want to put chemicals in their body, well, they're adults. But kids don't really have a choice in this matter, and somebody has to be looking out for them. And these epidemic diagnoses of especially ADHD and ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, both of those, there are too many kids receiving these diagnoses for no reason except that there's a certain kind of pressure now from pharmaceutical companies and classroom teachers and administrators to have certain behaviors extinguished. Let's just get rid of those behaviors. Get rid of kids saying no. Get rid of kids squirming. Get rid of kids being difficult by virtue of having them take
forget
chemicals.
about getting rid of the teacher that might be just boring everybody to death in the first place.
Or just forgetting what childhood is about.
Right.
And forgetting that most parents don't have terrific parenting skills. They don't.
Well, most parents are also outside of the home, too, this day and age. So.
That's right. That's right. And when they're in the home, they, like any human being, they want some peace and quiet, so they may lay down the law. They're probably not getting into really interesting discussions with their cooperative discussions with their kids about what might work in terms of parenting, but they're telling their kids what to do. And, it just seems natural to me that if you're a kid and you go to school and you're bullied or bored or this or that and the other thing, if you're having difficulties, how could that not play out as certain behaviors? Those difficulties are going to play out. That's the basis of family therapy, is the idea that if the child is going to come in as the identified patient, most typically, our kid has a problem, the family therapist is going to reframe that as, you've all got a problem. I don't know what the problem is yet, but I'm going to bet you a nickel that you've all got this problem, that it's a family situation that's, if not causing it, then certainly exacerbating what's normal anyway. I mean, if a kid is normally squirmy and certain family dynamics are going on, then those family dynamics may be making the kid super extra squirmy to the extent that this ADHD diagnosis is coming down the road.
No doubt about that. Our next category here would be loveless and distant families.
I think it's an interesting category because I think this is a place where mythology maybe does the most harm, where we have the mythology that people naturally love each other. And when I look at people, that's not my experience of what I see going on, that people are naturally loving each other. They seem to be more naturally critical of each other and a little resentful of each other and wanting to boss each other, and et cetera, rather than actually loving each other. I think love is a certain kind of work that most people are not that equal to. Maybe because, for an obvious reason, that they weren't loved themselves growing up, and maybe they don't even recognize it. They see something in the movies, or they read something in books that looks like to be about love, but what is loving really? Is it that easy to soften and be kind and be compassionate and all the things that actually amount to love? So it's all by way of saying that many families keep their distance and are much more loveless than people realize. And what happens from that is that, you leave that relationship probably having difficulty loving another person. You have to learn how to love.
And wouldn't it be fair to say, too, let's take a look at a parenting style, for instance, is the idea that we actually parent most of the time the way that our parents parented us.
Or in reaction to it, we try to go to 100% the other place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's true. I think those are the two things that we typically do, and we all have that bad feeling of noticing the extent to which we're parenting like our mother and father, and we swore that we would not do that. But I think that the other extreme is possible also, and that is if you grew up in a very rule-bound family, well, you might want to live in a sort of anarchistic way and live in a bohemian way just because you so didn't like that rule-bound way. So now you go to the other extreme of permissiveness and no rules and what have you. So I think both are true, that when we grow up in a family, we're either going to become rather like our parents or become quite the opposite of our parents, and neither extreme is going to work for us very well.
I might think that might be a particular tool would be to be present, how to be there now and just decide if this is the way it is here. And you talk about how when it comes to loving relationships, certainly, that, this is something that actually takes work. It isn't something that's just a given. And I think when it comes to families, a lot of us feel that, well, this is my family, they're supposed to be this way. Well, they're not. That's what's probably causing you the anxiety. So what are you going to do about it? And the other thing you suggest, too, is that you might want to think outside of the family a little bit there, maybe foster relationships with people outside of your family.
That's right. Sometimes we have to create a new family from friends and mentors and colleagues and peers and et cetera. We may have to do that. And, it makes sense that we may have to do that. We were born into a family that was not of our choosing, and it just may be the case that some family members, so to speak, don't work for us, and we have to find relationships outside. And, there are all of the tools that I'm talking about, presence in particular, do require work. Like, I've discovered that it's really hard for people to tolerate a difficult thought. Hard enough to act on our difficult thoughts, but just to even think a thought like, wow, I actually do need this divorce, or wow, my son is really in trouble. This is not a phase. This has now gone on too long. Something really unfortunate is going on, etc. To think that kind of thought is itself difficult to do. That's why I have an exercise that I work with clients on of just tolerating a difficult thought for 10 seconds. Not doing anything with the thought, not quickly trying to problem solve or create your plan of action or anything, but just to be with that thought for 10 seconds. It's really difficult for folks. And it's really difficult to make a change when a change needs to be made. I did a book called Life Purpose Boot Camp a couple of years ago, and in conjunction with that book, I did an interview series of folks. I interviewed folks who seemed to know their life purposes and their meaning needs pretty well. And to a person, I learned the following thing, that a point had come in their lives where they knew a big change was needed, big change, that the meaning had really drained out of their life and they needed to make a big change, and it still took them typically 5 or 6 years to make that change, to kind of build themselves up to the point of making that change. I think that's interesting, that it takes us so long to make big changes. So one of the mantras I would suggest to folks is just sooner rather than later, just that phrase, sooner rather than later. If you know kind of intuitively or through a tingle down your spine that 3-4 years from now, life's going to look different, that you're going to have to make a certain change, that the divorce is coming, or whatever the change might be, well, you might start saying to yourself sooner rather than later that I don't want to spend these next 5 years in this same really unhappy state, that I'd rather be moving in the direction of my next life more quickly than that.
Right. Sort of as life and motivational coach Anthony Robbins would say, when would now be a good time?
That's exactly right, and I think now is a little fast for most people, but maybe tomorrow or next week or pretty darn soon would be good.
Now this next one here I found really eye-opening here because I immediately thought of the Montagues and the Capulets, warring and divided families.
Yeah, I think it's really eye-opening the extent to which in most families there are some family members who are completely on the outs one from another. It's interesting. I've been doing interviews for this book for a little while now, for several weeks, and a host said to me that she had read the book and her husband and her brother had been completely on the outs for the longest time. And she didn't think that there was really anything that could be done about that, but that she was going to sort of use not exactly the exercises in the book, but kind of the spirit of the book to see if she could get a truce, get some rapprochement between the two of them. And she did that. She took them to a different location from the usual places where they wouldn't meet, and sat them down and tried to come from the heart. And to make this long story short, they did manufacture some kind of truce for the moment, which was a bit of a small human-sized miracle. But in most families, I think in most families, there are some folks who just won't talk to each other and are holding serious resentments. This comes up a lot for siblings when they have aging parents that need caring for. Maybe the siblings were always a little bit on the outs with each other, always resenting one thing or another. But now there's going to be somebody's going to be the designated caretaker, probably the eldest daughter or somebody like that is going to be the designated caretaker, and that person is going to be resentful of the ways in which the other siblings aren't helping, etc., etc. So I think that it's surprising the extent to which families are fighting and divided.
You know, Eric, I thought this was a really hardcore one because of how often we've talked about this for different segments throughout our program over the years. For instance, more or less recently we did one where a gentleman had written a book on how he had helped to reverse the symptoms of his mother's emphysema. She was a 74-year-old woman who had been a smoker most of her life. And she was at stage 4, so this is somebody who was really packing around an oxygen bottle just to get from the bathroom to the living room. Yep. So this guy stepped up to bat to see how could he at least help make his mother's life of better quality, and was able, as an engineer, to just start using the engineering mind to say, okay, how can I go about approaching this? Yep. So he was really able to turn around and reverse pretty much all the symptoms of his mother's emphysema within a course of something like 17 months. Off of oxygen, actually getting out and doing walks day in and day out, just feeling healthier. And when you think emphysema, you think once you get that, it's a death sentence. Yep. And he says, well, typically it is because of how our medical situation approaches these things. Mm-hmm. But so here's what happened. So as she turns her health around, apparently this woman had a fairly decent estate.
Uh-huh.
DSA. And so when you were mentioning that, these are the kinds of things. We
know where you're going.
All right. So certainly what happens is the older sister steps in now and says, well, guess what? Mom has decided to turn over the power of attorney to me, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to decide how her health care is going to be, and basically turned it all around and more or less undid what he had done. So in a course of less than 5 years, she ended up dying, and of course the sister got everything. Now this was somebody that wasn't even involved in the care at all, and now she gets everything. And you hear these stories and you just want to go and choke people out when you hear about it. At least I guess that's
exactly right.
but here,
I think the energy that's rising in you is the energy that rises in families. Families get really, really angry with each other. Family members get really, really angry with each other over these things. It just seems unconscionable. I think that's the word that comes up for folks. And what do you do with unconscionable things, whether it's macro stuff around the world or if it's within your family? What do? You get really angry is the first thing you do.
And so like I said, or you hear about this, whether, it could be a situation where, for instance, a family, a mother or father passes away and they don't leave any kind of a will. And so people they just come crawling out of the woodwork when it comes to this kind of a thing. And so you certainly talk about, in your book, how we need to deal with this. And I think that's kind of one of those situations where you could just kind of stay calm and maybe decide, I'm going to step out of this and you guys go ahead and you squabble all over it.
Maybe, or, it's hard to know, abstractly. In a real situation, it may require your strength and courage to stay in there so that you get your portion of the estate. I've had lots of clients who've walked for exactly the reason you said, that they can't stand what's going on. They can't stand how each family member is kind of grubbier than the next one. And so they walk out of the situation, and then they lose their portion of the estate that way. And that can be a life-changing negative to lose that portion of the estate. So I agree with you that that's one of those moments where we have to kind of pick our direction, whether it's the calm and clear and aware and I'm stepping aside, or the strong and present and courageous, I'm throwing my hat in this ring and I'm going to make sure that I get my share too. I think it's hard to know, from the outside what's the right thing to do. Both things are difficult.
And in this case here, as we talk about warring and divided families, it seems, too, that siblings, brothers and sisters, are usually the ones that seem to be at war with each other. I know we did a segment some time ago on sibling abuse where it was an older brother or sister abusing a younger one. And you'd be amazed on, because we like to post our interviews on YouTube, the thread that goes with that. Some of the stories, we were just amazed at some of the things that were going on. And one of the typical things that we were seeing in the conversation thread was this, that I was a younger sister who was abused, let's say, from my older sister. And it seemed that my parents, as I would talk to them about this, told me that I was overreacting.
Yep.
What's going on there?
Who knows? Isn't the answer who knows? Who knows how people can be that mean and cruel to each other, and how the parents can respond that way and act like nothing's going on, or that you're, quote, overreacting. That's why in the book I suggest for younger people that the first step in trying to deal with this is to try to find an ally. And maybe it's an aunt or an uncle or a cousin. Maybe it's somebody in the family, at least that you can talk to, who's not going to make you feel crazy. I mean, that's crazy making, to be told by your parents that the thing that you're experiencing isn't happening. It's crazy making. It's a good way to help you become really emotionally unwell. So
and chemically dependent later on in life.
Exactly. Wow. And so step one would be to try to find an ally in the family, and step two would be to try to find an ally outside of the family. I'm big on mentoring programs and other kinds of sort of non-psychological, non-technically therapeutic opportunities for young folks that are more like mentoring. And there are lots of those. There aren't as many as there need to be, but there are those kinds of opportunities where you can find, a peer counselor type person or an adult mentor type person, and at least have your experience validated. It's not like that person can jump into your family system and make things change, but at least you can have your experience validated.
Now, here's one that I think all of us have experienced, especially if we have another sibling in our family, certainly not living as the single person here, but demanding, critical, and argumentative families. How many times have you heard families demand, for instance, you get all A's when you go to school? You're critical because, your son isn't the best at every sport in school like you were growing up. This has got to be one of those, as you say, that cause really crazy conditions.
It does, and I think it goes beyond the things you said of being critical about something in particular. I find an awful lot of parents sort of when the second they see their child, they're already looking at their child with some kind of critical eye, like, what's she wearing? Is she a little dirty? Is she a little disheveled? Is she doing the right thing? It's a constant critical eye. That's the energy that the parent comes at when the parent approaches the child each time. So I think when you live in a family situation like that, where you're not just criticized about something in particular, but you're essentially being criticized about being you, I think that's where the experience of shame starts to arise. That experience that's so difficult to overcome over time. The experience of just not being an okay human being, not being worth anything. I think that's the sort of the terrible outcome of growing up in a super critical family are those feelings of shame.
I know you talk about, for instance, that in this particular case, children typically are most often the victims here, and that there are two types of methods that they employ, the first one being planful evasion and seeking and activating support. I wonder sometimes, because I remember having an experience with this back when I was in the 6th grade. There was someone who was in our class who I remember actually working for his dad. We pretty much lived out in the country during this time. He was a big foreboding man, and he was the kind of guy you could just tell when you woke up at sunrise, you got up and you're going to work, was this guy's attitude. And the sad part about this kid, as I got to know him, was that was back when we would do physical education, and we would go in the locker room, and then we would shower and get ready for the next class, and you would see black and blue marks on this kid.
Yep.
And the sad part about that wasn't just that, because the idea of what was going on in the home, but then he would actually have to take and experience that same thing in school.
Exactly.
And this was just a nice, genuine kid. I mean, I remember we had this swimming hole, this river that we used to play at that was close to our house, that we were down there all the time. One day, this guy shows up. He was allowed to go swimming, He was having a great time, and I got to really know him outside of school. And I got to be to the point where I was kind of looking out for him, like, I'm not going to allow people to just pick on this guy anymore. But you think, how is a way around something like that for a kid or for our listeners out there?
Oh, it's hard to imagine what the way is, isn't it? I mean, it's probably a lifetime of healing. It's probably those series of steps that we know is going to happen. He's probably going to get a clinical depression diagnosis, probably going to be addicted to something to help him soothe those bad feelings that he has. And then hopefully somewhere along the line, as he gets older and let's call it more mature, maybe he can begin to make the connection between what happened to him, what his experiences were, and where he now is. It's harder and harder to make that connection any longer, because when you go in to see a mental health professional who's using the pseudo-medical model of treatment, there's no connection made between where you are now and what's happened to you over time. It's that something's wrong with your plumbing, and here's the medication for the plumbing. So I think it's become even harder for an individual to make these connections, because that's not what the model supports. You probably are aware that the average time that a psychiatrist spends with a new patient is 15 minutes. What can go on in 15 minutes except a certain kind of transaction where I say I'm depressed, you say I'm depressed, and you start writing a prescription? That's all that could possibly go on in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. There can't be anything about my history, about my feelings, about context, about what actually happened to me in life.
Now, here's a category that I think a lot of us have also had experience with, whether on the extreme or at least from time to time. That is rule-bound, intrusive, and authoritarian families. Describe what we've got going on here.
Naturally, we need rules in life. Rules per se are not a problem. We need to know which side of the road to drive on and all those sorts of things. So rules aren't necessarily a bad thing. But rules that don't make any particular sense, that they come down hard on individuals, that sort of go against our common sense for what's necessary in life, those start to wear us down. They make us smaller over time. And especially if in that family system we're also being intruded upon. I think the clearest example of intrusion, and this was one of these crazy-making families, where there were no doors permitted on the bathrooms. Where does that come from? What kind of
wow?
What kind of unniceness is going on there? You can imagine that if you're growing up in a household like that, that's that intrusive, where every move is being scrutinized, that you're bound to grow up with all kinds of mental health issues. It just goes without saying.
I was just thinking about a particular rule, at least my mother had, was that when you sat down at the table, you were to eat everything that was on your plate, but she wasn't overwhelming about what she put on the plate, just a little bit of everything. And she also, for the most part, insisted, and this is without punishment for the most part, that you try everything at least once. And I was pretty glad for that rule, actually, because it was amazing how many times, I found things that, I'm not so sure, but I would try it anyway and think to myself, yeah, how much that actually crossed over into other areas of my life, where you would
that's
say...
Right, that's right. That's right. Not every
Mm-hmm.
rule is a bad rule.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of these rules, A, they're hypocritical, and B, they come from an unkind place. And one that comes to mind is there was a family situation where the parents would have these sort of lavish snacks, and the rule for the children was 3 potato chips. So where does that come from? I mean, we can sort of make up the narrative where that kind of rule could come from, but if your parents are having these lavish snacks in front of you and your rule is 3 potato chips, that has to be coming from an unfriendly, unkind place.
I also like this one, too, when you think of the word intrusive. What comes to mind is marriage relationships where, it could be the mother-in-law or mother that steps in and pretty much dictates how you're supposed to be living your life, and you've got to do this to please her. Otherwise, she's just going to leave, and so now you've got this in the balance. Do I continue on with this relationship I'm in? Boy.
Absolutely. That's certainly a classic out of literature and the movies, but also intrusiveness between the couple, not giving the other person space. I work as a creativity coach with creative performing artists, and here's a very typical intrusion for somebody, so to speak, of our age. And that is the woman's at home as an artist, maybe writing or painting or composing or what have you, and the husband, unfortunately, retires and is now around. And this is a dynamic because this is as much the woman's fault as the man's fault, but he just keeps wandering in, wondering what she's doing and wondering if she's available to do something with him now that he's retired. She has to say, from 8 to 12, I'm not free. She has to not allow for that intrusiveness. And he kind of has to hopefully notice that he's being intrusive. But that's a certain kind of intrusiveness that comes up in couples, especially when they spend a lot of time together.
I could see something like that happening, definitely. I know in my current relationship of more than 14 years now is that my wife pretty much works at home, and I'm at home quite a bit because we actually share in a business as well. And that can also be a real challenge for people, husbands and wives, who decide that they want to be in business together, because there is a lot of things you need to come together and concessions sometimes and understandings and growing that need to go on. Otherwise, if you're one of those couples out there that are considering going into a business for yourself together at home preferably, you better realize there is a growing curve there. Be willing to not only understand that, but be willing to decide, what kind of growth do you really want to have and what are your goals.
That's right.
And most importantly, when you embark on these little adventures, is to realize that outside perhaps your mother and father on either side is going to come in and tell you what they think is best for you and how you're going to deal with something like that.
You bet they are.
Oh, my goodness.
I grew up alone with my mom. My half brother and half sister were old enough that they were already out of the house when I was growing up, so I didn't really experience them. They were already off to college and in marriages and what have you. So it was really just my mom and myself at a certain point. After I told you I grew up in this large family, but about age 5, my mom and I moved out of that large family, and then from there on in, I just grew up with her. And so I would witness my friends' fathers coming home at that time when parents used to come home 5:30 or 6 from whatever the father was doing. The mother would be at home. The father would be out working. And I completely understood how unpleasant it was to have that father come home. All of the things we're talking about, whether it's intrusiveness or criticism or demanding stuff or bullying stuff or abusive stuff, it sort of happened the instant the father came home. And as a young kid, I read odd things, and one of the odd things I read was Sartre's autobiography, Les Mots, in which he had no father, and he said he was so happy not to have a father laying full length on him. And that's the way I felt about life, too, that I was really happy not having one of these huge guys, sort of the guy you described a moment ago, not having one of these huge guys' shadow cast over me. So I think that goes on. That's going to go on to the end of time, and I actually felt lucky not having that burden.
Now, we certainly haven't touched on all the family types, but I thought one that I would like to finish off with here, because I believe all families have this to one degree or another, and that's compulsive and addictive behavior.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I agree that almost every family has it because those obsessions and compulsions are partly the way we soothe ourselves and deal with anxiety, and everybody's dealing with anxiety in one way or another. But of course, when it rises to the place of an addiction, then the parent becomes unavailable in a certain sense and dangerous in a certain sense. And, when you can't trust that your parent is going to pick you up at 3 when he or she is supposed to, and all the sorts of things we know that go on with an addicted person, if you're in that family, then you're going to have those experiences of being somebody who has to deal. And if you want to, if you're an adult and if you want to be of help, there are things you can do to be of help to kind of aim a person or edge a person towards recovery. And I don't say that's our job, but I think probably somewhere inside of us we would like to do that. We would like to try to be of help and aim that person in the direction of recovery. But by the same token, if that person's nowhere near recovery, completely in denial and just leading an addicted life, then that may be one of those people we have to avoid over time because they're just not available and because they're dangerous.
Now, what are your thoughts, for instance, we could be talking about an addiction, and there may be a family member who most of the family feels something needs to be done here, and they do one of those situations where they sort of gang up on them.
An intervention.
That's what I was trying to think of the right word, and I just couldn't. And for some reason, I kept remembering this episode of that show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, where Kim Kardashian was just having this shopping problem, and so their family decides to do an intervention on her, and I'm thinking to myself, really?
Exactly.
But anyway.
What do I think about it? I think that if it's facilitated and if the facilitator is good, then interventions can be very powerful and useful. Let me come at this sideways. We may not quite have time for this, but in Finland, there's a model for dealing with mental distress called the open dialogue model, where if, let's say, you're a family member and you call in and you say that my son is hearing voices or what have you, rather than doing something traditional, a whole team comes out to your house and essentially tries to learn your child's language on the spot and essentially does an intervention with the whole family and a whole team in your living room. And so there are models around the world of that kind of intervention that are very powerful and seem to work very well. Now, if nobody is skilled at this, and if it's just family members teaming up or beating up on or trying to overpower a family member, that's probably not going to work very well. So I think the key here would be that somebody skillful is needed there to facilitate it and to help people come from the right place, so to speak, in the intervention.
Because I find it odd when we talk about, let's say, an addiction, and alcohol is one of the most prevalent ones, especially in the American society, is that, well, we need to gather around this family member because they seem to be drinking more than they should. And then you realize, well, but the rest of you still are drinking. What good does this do? Where do you think that habit came from?
Exactly. That's why that's one of our themes that we're chatting about, is not thinking of things as individual issues, but just looking at how these dynamics are sustained by the way everybody in the family is operating. I think I have an anecdote in the book about one woman in an overweight family trying to eat in a healthy way and just how difficult that was, how she's demeaned by everyone and laughed at and ridiculed. And so how can she do her job? I mean, it's hard enough to diet and maintain a reasonable weight and eat healthy in our society. All of that's hard enough. And then to have your family be against your efforts, well,
right.
Goes
or,
saying.
You could be that person who's looking to change because you want a better life for yourself, and you got the family stepping in, and they're giving you a hard time because they like the way you were.
exactly.
Mm-hmm. And here's another phenomenon, too, that I wanted to bring up, especially when it comes to this particular category, is that, and it's not just this one specifically, but certainly you see a lot of this in this experience, is children actually becoming the parents of their parents.
Absolutely. And that seems to be happening more and more. I'm not quite sure how the kind of the middle generation got extra burdened nowadays.
Right.
But that does seem to be happening more and more. I'm not exactly sure why that's happening, but I agree that looks to be happening.
Eric, it's certainly been a pleasure to have you here on the program, and as I was saying to the listeners, we certainly covered a good couple of these family dynamics here, and certainly the tools that you share in your book about how you can overcome your difficult family. Is there a website that people can find out more about your work, how they can get the book, things like that?
Sure. Coming to my main site is the place to go, and that's ericmaisel.com, and that's EricMaisel.com.
Well, Eric, this has certainly been an enjoyable conversation, one you feel like you can just kind of go on forever and share lots of stories. But certainly I think our listeners can feel, as we've talked about these different things, I think there's a little bit of this in all of us. The question is what to do about it, and maybe even make the decision should anything be done about it, but that's certainly up to you. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can discover more. Visit us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Please sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.